Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Lee Vinsel, and I'm an assistant professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. I'm also one of the co-directors of the Maintainers, an organization that tries to draw attention to maintenance and repair and the work that keeps our world going. Today, we're presenting Future of Work, a roundtable discussion with Patrick McCray, Diane Bailey, and Yulia Frumer. In the last few years, both popular and academic outlets have been paying renewed attention to the relationship between technology and work, and often framed through so-called future of work. Questions focus on how technology shapes organizational change and whether new technologies will lead to unemployment and depressed wages. In this virtual roundtable, Patrick McCray and I will lead a discussion on how science and technology studies and related fields can shed new light on these topics. So I'm your lead facilitator today, and my colleague Jess Meyerson, another co-director of the Maintainers, is going to be in the background helping us out. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in your Zoom control panel, and we'll bring them up during the presentation. Jess will bring them forward for us, and we'll also have time for questions at the end. Also, if you're not a guest speaker, we ask that you mute yourself and turn off your camera to preserve the quality of recording. It just has to do with how bandwidth works with Zoom. And without further ado, I'm going to discuss or introduce our guests. So first up is Patrick McCray. He's a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His most recent books include The Visioneers, How a Group of Elite Scientists Pursued Space Colonies, Nanotechnologies, and a Limitless Future, and Groovy Science, Science, Technology, and American Counterculture, co-edited with Dave Kaiser. He's currently finishing a new book for the MIT Press, tentatively titled Making Art Work, which will appear in mid-2020. It looks at the collaboration between artists, engineers, and scientists from the 1950s to the present, and explores how new creative cultures were built and maintained. Diane Bailey is the, how do you say this, Diane? Jerry Gay?
That's right.
Jerry Gay Professor of Communication at Cornell University, Department of Communication in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. She earned her PhD in Industrial Engineering and Operations Research at the University of California, Berkeley. And she recently led a 10-year study on the role of advanced IT, including sophisticated computational software in engineering analysis and design. And her current research investigates remote occupational socialization, or how via IT individuals learn and perform occupations far from communities of similar practitioners. And finally, Yulia Frumer is an associate professor of East Asian Science and Technology in the History of Science and Technology Department at Johns Hopkins University. She studies technological developments in Japan from the early modern period to the 21st century. Her research these days looks at the long history of Japanese humanoid robots, and specifically, she shows that the history of robotics engineering helps us understand why certain actions count as labor while others don't. And she's looking at current developments in Japanese humanoid robotics. And she also highlights the fact that while potentially useful, robotics technologies can also serve to conceal and therefore exploit real living human beings. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to my friend Patrick, who's going to give us kind of a background and overview of the topic.
Okay, so thanks, Lee. Lee asked me to provide sort of an overview and introduction to today's discussion. And our roundtable today actually has its origins in some conversations that Lee and I had with people at organizations like the World Economic Forum starting about 3 years ago. We were stimulated by pronouncements that various companies and even national economies were preparing for something called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. As the World Economic Forum has framed it, in their telling, a first industrial revolution took place starting in the 1780s, in which there were technologies powered by water and steam. This was then followed by a second industrial revolution about a century later as electricity-based technologies enabled mass production with the division of labor. And then a third industrial revolution in their framing took place sometime around 1970, in which electronics and computing technologies were used for widespread automation and information processing. And of course, all of these transitions are deeply tied to discussions about work and labor. And there's, of course, lots of squishiness in these delineations, the sort that can keep historians chasing their tails for years. But clearly, the World Economic Forum and the companies that they interact with imagine that something new is over the horizon. And we see this every day in articles about autonomous vehicles and data privacy and machine learning. And some of the anxieties around this are justified. And of course, some are what our colleague David Brock calls wishful worries that distract us from real and pressing issues. But groups like the World Economic Forum, which have the potential to sort of shape the framing and the agenda of these discussions, at least from one particular perspective, see some sort of accelerating development of currently emerging and converging technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics as somehow fundamentally transforming the way that people live and work. In this view, discussions about a fourth industrial revolution hold both promises of economic growth as well as perils for great social dangers, including mass unemployment and increasing economic inequality. Now, central to questions like these, of course, is our topic for today. What is the future of work? And how can insights from fields like history, sociology, communications, and science and technology studies help us better understand it? About a year ago, Lee and I helped convene a workshop at the Computer History Museum in Silicon Valley to talk about some of these topics. And two of our panelists today, Yulia Frumer and Diane Bailey, participated in that two-day discussion. So it's wonderful to get the band back together, so to speak, for today's discussion. And the essays that came out of this workshop are also available for reading and sharing, and we can send a link to those if you're interested. I think this is something Jess or Lee can do. But basically, we started with this idea that when science and technology studies first emerged as a field about 50 years ago, a wide range of people, including academics and activists, they asked tough moral and political questions about the Vietnam War, environmental degradation, the relation of women and minorities to technological change. And these pressing societal concerns helped catalyze a whole outpouring of scholarship built around how understanding different interest groups materialized and competed to influence new technologies. And out of this ferment of ideas, the first major theory and method for studying technology and society emerged. This intellectual framework became known as the social construction of technology. It's pretty well accepted and understood today. But although it's been a paradigm for thinking about how technologies change and develop for quite some time, it does have limits for understanding technology today. It's produced meticulously researched case studies that focused on novelty and invention, but oftentimes these have become increasingly detached from ordinary people's everyday activities in the workplace. And just as problematic is that this constructivist approach was not always useful for thinking about power, political relations, and social hierarchies, the sorts of relations that are central to thinking about the future of work. Of course, we know that technologies often reinforce and even exacerbate existing asymmetries in power. For instance, men whose jobs are being displaced by technological and economic change are often reported to be struggling with a sense of agency and changing senses of self-worth. So one way to redirect some of this scholarship was to seek out some topics which had the potential to resonate with the experiences, hopes, and anxieties of a broad group of people, hence our interest in the future of work. So, I started my professional career as an engineer. It's what all of my degrees are in. But for the past 20 years, I've been researching and writing about the history of technology. And when I entered this field in the 1990s, there was a whole series of now classic books which focused on labor and manufacturing. Authors like David Hounshell, Lindy Biggs, Shoshana Zuboff, David Noble, all paid careful attention to what the experience of work was like in the past, what factory life was like, and how labor management and technology have intersected with one another. And I'd like to suggest that it's time to rejuvenate some of these topics, which have in various ways gone into hibernation somewhat. So personally, I'm interested in the question of what did the future of work look like in the past? How did we imagine the workplace, the labor force, and the effects of technology a half century or so ago? And I'm interested in this not just as some sort of dry scholarly topic, but also as someone interested in creating what I'll call a usable past, something that might inform colleagues in other humanities and social science disciplines, as well as speak to engineers and policymakers. And we see, I think, some moves in this direction more recently through the work of people like Louis Hyman and his excellent book, Temp, which looks at the roots of today's gig economy. And at the same time, we also have lots of what I'll call algorithmic studies, books that look at the recent history of data and information and how the tools to create and use them are full of all sorts of biases. So I'm thinking of books by Sophia Noble, Dana Boyd, and others, all looking at what we can sort of call the social life of algorithms. But less central in these works is, well, work. And related to this is a tendency, I think, among journalists and other writers to constrain themselves when thinking about technology. Too often these days, to write about technology companies means about writing about Facebook, Google, and Amazon. This obscures the reality, of course, that all companies are technology companies. This country's biggest employer is Walmart, followed by Exxon. And of course, the future of work looks a lot different when seen not from Mountain View, but maybe from Bentonville, Arkansas, or Midland, Texas. Even as we're talking here today, some 50,000 workers from General Motors are on strike. And one of the key questions that they're concerned about is further industrial automation. So surely understanding the longer history of this concept, the future of work, automation, not just as policy, but lived experience could help inform our understanding of what's happening now at GM plants in Detroit and elsewhere. In 1974, the journalist Studs Terkel published his now classic book, Working, and the subtitle says it all. People talk about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. And I'd be really interested to see what a revisitation of this project would look like. But to conclude, I think through forums like the one that we're having today, it offers a chance to encourage people to return to some of the fundamental political and moral issues that helped animate science and technology studies in the first place. A new program of technology studies should have a good deal to say about core questions like, what is the future of work? Or not only does technology eliminate jobs, but what kind of jobs and how does that process work? How does the consideration of gender and other forms of diversity lead to new innovations in technology? Now, these are the sorts of scholarly questions that I think can translate directly to and connect with immediate economic and societal concerns. And I'm, of course, very glad to be part of this discussion today, as well as the larger maintainers network that Lee and Andy Russell and Jessica and everyone else have helped build. So with that having been said, I think Lee will take the helm from here and we'll hear from our panelists. So Lee.
Thanks so much, Patrick.
You're welcome.
So we'll dive into a moderated discussion with Patrick and Diane and Yulia at this point. And Diane and Yulia, the first question I have, and you can answer this in different ways. I mean, Diane, you've been working on these labor issues for a long time, and Yulia, you're looking at the history of labor in a variety of ways. So the question is, what is different about today's visions and discussions regarding the future of work compared with previous periods of seeming significant change in your view? Diane, why don't you start us off?
In terms of the view, I don't see a lot of difference. A couple years ago, I was curious about all of the talk about mass unemployment and the future of work because of technology. And I thought there sure were a lot of books out right now. And I wondered if that number was greater than in the past. So I plotted out this little chart from like 1945 until the present day. And you could see these bumps in the academic books on the future of work. And those bumps seem to correlate with major technologies that were coming along. And so some of those technologies were machine sensors and controls, numerical controls. Some of them later became computers, desktop computers, the internet, broadband. And then the most recent one was AI. And the thing is that the chart just took off. It looked like some global warming chart or something. It just took off in recent years with huge spike for books on AI. And then relatedly, since the last chapter of these books has to do with leisure, like what are we going to do with all this leisure time that we're going to have because we're all going to be out of work, I looked at academic books on leisure and they they kind of shadowed those same peaks as they went along just a year or two later. So I think that the kind of story that we're all going to be out of work is not a new story. But I think that whereas that used to be kind of hidden in a few academic books and not broadly talked about, it's taken the public's imagination and is really hyped in a way today that it hasn't been so much in the past. Just because the kinds of people who are writing the books have broadened too. It's not just a few academics, but it's a lot of technologists.
Yeah. Yulia, does it look different if we think about this issue in Japan?
I think I so agree with Diane. It does look that there are so many similarities, and I'm thinking of all the predictions about what robots are going to be able to do within 5-10 years. And I can really see things that are written a month ago and in 1963, that they're almost identical. Both, even if we look at the cartoons that they kind of depict the near future, they actually look almost the same. A little bit of difference in style, but they present this similar kind of idea, similar kind of future. And of course, like this tendency to say, oh, we're going to be able to do this in 10 years or 15, to give a number to a year. And the sci-fi scenario of like the kind of futuristic homes where you don't need to do anything. And as Diane said, what are we going to do with all the leisure? But I think that what changed now is that, first of all, we can look back at 1960s and say, here are all these people that they were promising us technology in 10 years, and now we're 50 years after that deadline, and we're nowhere near realizing anything that they were doing. Another thing that is really, really different is that when in 1960s, when a lot of engineers were going into trying to design, and they were so optimistic about their abilities to design robots that they will be eliminating any need for human labor, there was a lot of jobs. So a lot of them were finding jobs, and the market is not the same right now. So the young people who are studying engineering right now and who are thinking about going engineering, they're much, much more realistic, both about their own chances, but also they're preoccupied with questions that they're much more down to earth, rather than thinking in more kind of broad terms. And the final thing, I think that there is a, Patrick mentioned the feminist intervention in science and technology studies, and having women's perspective on work is a difference, because when in 1960s in Japan, when there was imaginations of how robots will replace household work, nobody challenged this. When in the last decade, when Japanese government says we're going to invent robots, that the robots are going to take care of household work, a lot of women come up and say, you have no idea what household work is, because you focus on very, very visible tasks, but you don't notice all the other things that are going on, that they're the core of what was going on in household. So I think that this is, and we see it in scholarship as well, like a lot of feminist perspective on the invisible work, invisible labor, that allows us to focus more and look at all the details that they're left out of this picture that only shows the very, very visible surface of what labor is.
Nice. I love that. The second question I had has to do with, I mean, obviously this is a topic that's very much in the air in popular discourse. We see it in the newspaper all the time. But I mean, I think there's a question about how we relate to things that are currently hot. And so the question is, what is the relationship for you between the questions scholars should be asking about technology and work, and the question that activists, critics, and journalists and like are asking today when you think about these topics? Diane, I think I'll kick it off back to you again.
So it's funny. I've got a paper that's conditionally accepted, that where what my colleague and I, Steve Barley, are arguing is how we ought to go about studying artificial intelligence and emerging technologies, and how we study them might be a little different than we had in the past studied things. But I think one of the things that I would say is that where I think that scholars understand something that others don't necessarily do, has to do with choice. And it gets to something that Patrick had mentioned when he talked about the social construction of technology, that implicit in what he was saying there was that we're going to accept that technologies aren't deterministic. Okay, so we might accept, so if we swing that pendulum just a little bit back from Scott, we might accept that there are some aspects of the technology that are pretty firmly shaping. They don't allow for a lot of wiggle room, but the reality is that we have choices about the technologies that we use. We certainly do as individuals, and those choices can get constrained over time. It's very hard to park your car these days if you don't have a smartphone with an app for how to park your car, right? But at work, we might have less choice, but that's not that humans have less choice, it's that our managers make those choices for us, right? And so when we have those choices, we have to accept that we don't have to have a future that's the future that's being painted for us. So if mass unemployment is that future that people think that we're going to have, why do we have to accept that? We don't have to accept that. And so one of the things that we're talking about is, Patrick had mentioned that one of the problems with Scott was that it doesn't look enough at the power dynamics involved in design. And we absolutely think that that's true. At the other end, away from design is use. And we tend to think of use, particularly scholars like me. I'm a scholar of technology and work. So I tend to look at what happens within the workplace. But the ramifications of these technologies go far beyond just the workplace. So they're going to affect, for example, if we have more of us not working or working shorter hours, that's going to affect everything in our urban landscapes and our rural landscapes, our suburban landscapes. So do we need as many parking garages downtown? Do we need 2-car garages in our suburban homes? Shouldn't all the freeways be headed out to the national parks and the state parks because we're going to be doing more recreation, right? And so we really start needing to bring everyone into the conversation, not just the maintainers of the technology, though I think that's important, but kind of the maintainers of all of our social and technical urban infrastructures, our communities. So let's have religious scholars, let's have urban planners, let's have political science majors, let's have social workers. We all need to get involved in the conversation and say, if we were going to be thoughtful about this, what kind of world do we want to create? And then let's design a technology to do that. And the last thing that I will add is that because it's actually taking them longer to design the AI than the hype, the good news is they got us all scared and worried. And the better news is, and now we have time to do something about it because they're not building it as fast as they thought they would.
That's great. And Yulia, how about you, this question about kind of activism and criticism and, scholarly research, especially if you're a historian, I guess.
It's really interesting. So today is my heavy teaching day. I'm in between 2 seminars. In the morning, I had a freshman seminar on technoethics. And in the afternoon, I'm going to have a seminar on prosthetics and technology of disability. And in both of these, there's very, very visible and audible combination of historical research and students' attempts to link it to activism as much as possible. And I think that especially it's not related to work, it's more related to disability studies. There is a kind of classic rift between history of technology and STS and disability studies. And disability studies claim that the STS is not active enough, and Patrick alluded to this. But we do see changes, and in several of our colleagues, and I'm thinking of Jai Virdi specifically, that they're very, very successfully combining the historical research with activism and showing the value of historical research to activism to expose which are the populations that are harmed and in what way they are harmed. At the same time, I do think that there is a lot that historians can learn from activists. Because one of the things that when we're analyzing users, when we're analyzing something as DIY designs, we're looking at pushbacks, right? So activism and viewpoint of activists can provide us insight into all the different kinds of pushback to technology that we may not notice otherwise.
That's nice. One of the things we want to do with these conversations is kind of build a knowledge base for people to draw on. So, you know, this video will be available for people to watch later. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask is pretty simple. I just wanted to ask you both for 1 or 2 classic readings that you would suggest on the future of work for people who are on the call now and, you know, for later. So Diane, I'll start with you again.
Well, I think that some of the classic books that Patrick mentioned are certainly been formative for me. David Noble's Forces of Production and Zuboff's book. I think that Zuboff's book in particular provides such a nice historical context and helps us really understand sentient knowledge and what goes on as we change technologies and the kinds of different skills that workers have to have, and how the social aspects of work are going to change as well because of those skills.
This is Age of Smart Machines, In the Age of Smart Machines for 88.
Exactly, that book. I haven't, I've purchased but haven't read yet her newest one on surveillance capitalism, but I think she's again right on target from what I've seen of reviews of the book.
Cool. How about you, Yulia? A reading or 2 that you would suggest?
My all-time favorite, and not just for questions of labor, but in question of for history of technology, is Cohen's More Work for Mother. Like, this is it's such a fantastic book. It's it exposes so many different aspects of labor, and it's students love it. I love it. It's great. I teach it as much as possible.
Yeah. You know, this is a related question, I guess. How have you or how will you teach this stuff? So I know Yulia is teaching a seminar related to this topic in the spring, and I know that Diane, I'm sure you've been teaching stuff related to this for a long time. So again, Diane, I'll start with you, and you know, like, how do you approach this topic in the classroom?
So I've approached it 2 ways. Last year I did a seminar on AI, robotics, and algorithms. But I have to say that when I taught the class last year, there weren't that many papers out there on the topic. And there's certainly been a lot more papers printed in the past year. But I would also say that I've been to several conferences this summer where I was very excited because I thought I was going to hear talks on AI. And then I went to the talk and the person said, well, we thought we would be discussing our preliminary results, but actually they haven't implemented the AI yet. So we'll give conceptual talk, okay? I took that ultimately as good news. Another way that I've taught it that's been kind of fun is I teach a class on objects, models, and representations because it's much more than just learning algorithms. What we're seeing is a digitization of work that's increasing. And part of that digitization is that we now have virtual representations of many physical objects. So if I studied automotive engineers, what I was seeing was simulated crashes. Mm-hmm. And it's important for us to understand what those representations offer and how one might reconfigure work. Because what happened when we saw a simulation, for example, enter automotive engineering work wasn't that we reduced the number of engineers who did work. We reduced the number of American engineers who did work. Because now the digital files with the simulations could be sent abroad to engineers who could be paid less in other countries, and they did a freezing hire here in the US. So I think understanding representations and understanding the role of the physical in conjunction with the digital is another way for us to examine the impact of these technologies in work.
Nice. Yulia?
I think that it really, really depends. I mean, unfortunately, I only teach one graduate seminar a year. So most of my teaching is undergraduate, and with graduate students, I think it's a very, very exploratory endeavor. And we have students from history of science and technology, from history of medicine, from anthropology and sociology who come together, and each one of them brings their own discipline and disciplinary methods that that it just creates discussion that takes off in different directions. And I'm honestly open to see what's going to happen in a seminar when we read both the classics that were mentioned here, but also newer work like Billy Irani's new book.
Mm-hmm.
I think that for undergraduates it's very, very different. Undergraduates really want to hear a positive message. And that's one of the problems that a lot of humanities and critical disciplines have, that we're very, very good in critiquing. And my students understand that. They understand the critique and they relate to the critique, but they want to take it one step further, especially those who, I have a lot of students from engineering, and they say, well, okay, so what do I do? What do I do? Like if I go and I work in a firm, like I'm not gonna go to my boss and start critiquing. Like I need to find a method. So I think this is a problem that I was struggling a lot with. And the way that I see it, we have at Hopkins, there is this wonderful series. It's the Sawyer Seminar on data in the world of uncertainty, which tries to bring together scholars from different disciplines and across the divide between humanists and scientists. So we have mathematicians, physicists, and engineers as well. And I think that part of developing the positive message is really learning how to speak to each other and speak each other's language, which I'm still struggling. I haven't figured it out yet. But some of my graduate students are doing much better than I do. So I do see a way further.
Nice. We wanted to have kind of a fairly free-flowing conversation, but I think I would be failing at my job if I didn't ask you something about maintenance, given how we're putting this together. So, one way into this is, I know from, this is a kind of classic finding when people study automation, like David Hounshell in the edited volume Fordism Reformed, looks at automation at Ford. And then more recently out of Data and Society, there's a report called AI in Context. And I think both of these things find, which others have found, that as you increase automation, you increase the amount of maintenance work that has to be done, basically. You're boosting maintenance labor. So I just wondered, kind of what you found in your work, especially. Diane, I'd love to hear what you've been finding around this. And Yulia, you too, with your robots, like where does maintenance fit into this automation picture, which is so often just about automation or innovation and the new things that are going to like revolutionize the world. Diane, I'll start with you again.
So friends of mine, Bonnie Nardi and Hamid Ekbia, wrote a book that they titled Heteromation. And the term that they've created here is to say that it's the opposite of automation. It doesn't mean that we're trying to get rid of the human entirely. It's in fact that we design systems that absolutely need our involvement in order for them to be successful. So an example is if my university sends me a notice for a new software program that they've purchased that is going to help me find research colleagues. And the software has crawled the web and found everything that I've ever submitted anywhere: conference papers, grant proposals, papers that got published, anything, anywhere. And it's put together everything, and it's decided on its own what my expertise is. And the first thing I'm asked is, please log in and clean up my profile, right? And I'm like, how are you helping me here? I got to go in and clean up my profile. That's heteromated labor. That's labor that the system is asking us to do, okay? Because it can't succeed on its own. And we studied this in Brazil with a banking system that was put in place for underserved and poor populations, and how the system really never worked, except that the folks who were running the system did so much extra labor beyond what was designed. And I think that we see this in AI systems all the time. And you see this, for example, with lots of platform work. There is a lot that has to be done beyond just operating the software and entering the platform, that labor that we do, and it doesn't always get counted as labor. So I think maintenance issues are huge with the kinds of technologies that we're increasingly seeing.
Awesome. Yulia, how about you?
You know, I'm working now specifically on a period of 1960s and 1970s, and there's actually a shift in Japan, at least, and with kind of thinking about maintenance from a standpoint of engineers. And in the 60s, the task of engineers was to think of automating maintenance. They imagined that they can actually create a versatile robot that will be able to also handle materials that are not the flow materials. So they will be able, so they wanted to create a completely humanless factory floor. So there, the robots will do everything. And then something changes and towards the 70s. And they just give up. They no longer try to automate everything. And instead they talk about systems engineering. And then they talk about their own systems of maintenance and connections that needed in order to create robots. And I think that when you look at the charts, that they start charting out of what goes into creating some kind of technology, a robot. These charts very, very quickly just spiral out of control. They become so big that it's impossible to contain them on a page. And I think that it's something that is worth paying attention to and learning from engineers' own experience of trying to understand their own systems of maintenance.
Nice. Yeah, it's funny. Business consultants in the 1960s in the U.S. gave up on the idea that you could automate maintenance at about that time too. They were like, actually, this is very hard. It's the last thing you're ever going to automate. So just shunt that to the side. Andy, can I bring you in for a second? Because you have this interesting thing about, so New York State's putting $175 million into towards a workforce development initiative. And I'm sure that announcement's all larded up with like 21st century skills and like what's going to happen in the future and how we have to like prepare people for a different economy and stuff like that. So I just, I wanted you to reflect a bit on that and maybe connect to the conversation and think about how, the conversation we've been having connects to like workforce training and what we're doing at universities.
I don't know if you read it or if you just knew instinctively that one of the categories was 21st century skills.
I just knew it.
On the website. Yeah, so that number's right. The idea is, so if those of you who aren't familiar with New York State, it's allegedly post-industrial, certainly in the Northeast, declining population, and a lot of concern about economic security, especially for at-risk groups or historically disadvantaged groups. And so in the upstate region where I am is faring much worse than the city. So the idea is to give out money that's really driven by needs of business, and it's a collaborative. There's a lot of like criteria. And I think the most interesting point of connection with this conversation is about collaboration, and to some of Diane's points about including as many people as possible in the conversation. So we're working on a proposal, and here at SUNY Poly, I'm in Utica, right in the middle of New York State, and it's led us to talk to businesses about what they actually want, and they don't just want STEM people, although that's a big part of it. They want people who can speak persuasively and think in complex terms. They want the sort of students that I think we want our students to be. So it's connections with businesses, but also thinking like in a Latourian but power-inflected way about the network that we need to build to be successful. We need people with political savvy and connections in the community because that's the way that the monies are flowing from the state. So we need those powerful nodes. we need to give a little bit too. Like, so I can't flip the table over and scream when I hear people say we're going to be the next Silicon Valley. Like, no, for the love of, don't do that. And I think where they especially need the help of people with our backgrounds is to think in terms of analogies with a clarity that this conversation is talking about, that historians in STS, I'm a historian, but others in STS are really capable of doing. So what is this like and what is it not like? And I think we can contribute uniquely in that way. So, but it's really about the network and the strength of the network and figuring out what nodes need to be strengthened and kind of moving from there.
Diana and Yulia, I was just wondering, given Andy's reflections, like how you think about kind of workforce issues in the classroom, like, teaching up the next generation and all that kind of stuff when you think about these issues.
We do, labor is one of the topics that we discuss in the class on techno-ethics. And I think that students actually are very, very responsive to the question of a new digital underclass. And of course, I think it's, the variety of examples that especially younger students and freshmen that they're exposed to, there are the things that you mentioned, that there are Amazon and the Facebook and what everybody talks about. But once they start talking about examples that they know, it's very, very easy then to draw them and to talk about things that they didn't think about before. And I think that, like, I actually have students say in the class, oh, I didn't know about this, I didn't think about this. So they, those of engineers, especially in my class, they are constantly thinking in terms of what kind of labor they are going to be doing when they work, what kind of labor they're going to be relying on, who are the people that their work is going to affect. So I think that I think that it's a very productive way of linking labor and ethics in undergraduate education.
Nice. I want to kind of tack away at this point to audience questions, and be sure to leave 15 minutes for those. And Patrick, please, if you have questions at any point, throw them in too. We have a question from Jess Farrell. So she says that it's her perception of something she's heard, something I've heard too, by the way, is that one reason automation hasn't taken off in the economy is that it's cheaper for businesses to hire the cheapest human labor out there, or forced unpaid labor that still exists, than it is for them to actually implement full systems of automation. And she's asking what you've seen in your research or know about this. I must say that this is something I've heard quite often, especially from Marxist friends, about the failure to automate. So Yulia or Diane, either one of you have thoughts on this issue of cheap labor versus systems?
Well, I think you can look at the example of Uber. I don't know how you get any cheaper than employees that you don't consider employees, contract workers, yet Uber's poured quite a bit of money into developing self-driving vehicles. I think that, yes, they prefer cheap workers, and if your work is something that you can offshore, so that you can avoid not just labor costs, but also environmental laws and that type of thing, then companies tend to take that choice. They're always looking to drive down their bottom line. Yeah. But if they can't do that, then they're looking to replace us for all kinds of reasons beyond just our hourly wage. It's that we make demands. Those GM workers are out on strike, right? And that doesn't really work well for corporations. So I think that there's a real push for them to do this. There's a total fear. You'll hear people saying the most ridiculous things. They'll say, like, well, if we don't build this AI, then China will do it first, or Japan will do it first, and they'll automate our jobs. But it's like, how are they going to come over here and automate our job? Like it just doesn't make sense. We're doing this to ourselves, and you're rushed to do it first. often I think it's driven more by military concerns than necessarily industrial concerns, but there's this idea that we need to do it. And I think that also what we have are a bunch of extremely talented, extremely smart, and very well-funded researchers who are working on these questions. And I think that they're committed to getting to those answers, because I think in their world, this is their Mount Everest. And so I just see them constantly pushing, and they're going to be adopters.
Huh. That's, wow. Yeah, I mean, to be clear, you're saying that like automation is their Mount Everest. That's what they're trying to do.
I think things like AI. I think AI is the Mount Everest for a whole cohort, a whole legion of computer scientists. It has been for years and years and years, and they're determined. And it's well funded.
That's awesome. How about you, Yulia? Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, of course, it's so often it happens that somebody comes up with a wonderful robot that promises to do all kind of work, and it's in a promotional video. It looks very, very nice, but then somebody actually tries to use it, and it's very, very quickly becomes clear that it just takes so much effort to keep this robot going that it's not worth it. But I don't think that it's something that actually prevents automation, and I think that oftentimes if people decide to use people's labor and not machine labor, it's not just because it's cheaper, but because oftentimes people do it a better quality of labor, especially when we talk about robots. And now in Japan, there's the whole discussion about elderly care, and so this kind of work, and machines just cannot do what humans can do. What's interesting, and that's very, very much what Diane told them, it very resonated with me, like the kind of the Mount Everest, because there's a lot of push of create the facade of automation. So when roboticists realize that they actually cannot, at least yet, create robots that will be able to do all the tasks that they promise to do, now they're working on remotely operated robots. So there are humans behind this robot that they're doing the work and manipulating the robot, but it looks like it's fully automated. Because what the other side sees is just a cute little robot, the kind of humanoid that handles things and does. So there is this sense that, we know that they're humans. I mean, at least the engineers know that they're humans, but there's an attempt to present automation as if we're already there, as if they're already achieved this level.
I've heard of this robot. There's a grad student here at Virginia Tech working on robots, and he said there's a robot hotel somewhere. I think it might be in Taiwan. And he said, in fact, it's humans doing most of the work behind the scenes. So there's robots you interact with, but all the labor behind the walls is being done by people.
Yeah, I mean, it works like a gimmick, right? Like it's a wonderful gimmick, but absolutely.
Disneyland.
Okay, so I didn't think I was going to go here, but I'm going to go here. One of the things that I'm writing about now are sex robots, also called sex bots. And the reason I got interested in them is through a student who wanted to write this paper. And I said, what's the work angle? And it turns out that they are starting to open or trying to open brothels. One was in Houston and it got closed. Apparently there's one in Barcelona. And these brothels have, instead of human workers, they have sex bots. So you can imagine that for certain work, there will be an easier time of replacing humans than in some other forms of work. And it's interesting because it challenges, in that context, so many of the moral, feminist, and safety arguments that we might have around sex work might really be transformed with the introduction of sex bots into that discourse.
We had another two related questions from MC4L. Are there any policy threads relevant to the future of work that you're following closely? So she mentions the stuff around independent contractors in California, being qualified as actual workers. And the other one is, to what extent do you see the research you're doing as speaking to policymakers on these topics? Diane, why don't we start with you first?
So, like Patrick, all three of my degrees are in engineering, and I think I just go further and further astray from engineering as the years move on. And one of the places that I would love to head is policy. But the closest that I've gotten to that so far was with a piece that I did in Issues in Science and Technology that came out of our workshop that we did 2 years ago, which is around the rhetoric of safety with autonomous vehicles. So my answer is no, there are no policy threads that I'm currently looking at, but it's absolutely the area where I think more and more of us need to head.
Yulia, how about you?
You know, I tried to do that. I was part of this network that it's US-Japan network that connects younger scholars with policymakers both in DC and Tokyo. And scholars are both historians and economists and social scientists, political scientists. And I must say that I'm not sure I found a way to talk to policymakers. And I don't think that I convinced people like with this whole thing that, you know, don't look just at the tasks that are visible, but also look at the work around. I think that there were some nodding heads and then like, when will we have a robot that do that? So, okay, so we're not there yet, but when are we going to be able to do so? So honestly, I don't know. Like I would love to try again, but I had troubles trying to make this point across.
Yeah. This is an interesting question from Jess Farrell. And it has to do with the idea of degrowing the economy, the notion of degrowth when it comes to climate change and stuff. So I think Jess can clarify if I'm wrong, but I think the notion is that some people are arguing that we actually have to degrow the economy for reasons of climate. And so her question is, how do you think degrowth would affect the future of work? How do you think it ties to these issues? And if you don't have direct thoughts on that, I guess we could talk about how climate change and climate policy might affect it. I know that's something we talked about at a workshop. Diane, do you have thoughts on this?
No, it's an interesting question because in so many ways, I think that what we've seen is accelerated growth because of the rise of the BRIC countries, because of what we see in India and China, for example, and the accelerated growth. And degrowth would be lovely, but again, you know, I feel like the thing I like about this concept is it also suggests a bit of planning, and I really think that that's where we need to start heading. So, and that we can say to anyone who would put forward some neoliberal arguments about how, well, we can't do this, you know, that we have to let the market decide, is that when technologists and economists offer us a universal basic income as a solution for mass unemployment, isn't that a government or corporate socialism? Isn't the fact that we're going to be paid that? So if we're going to do that kind of planning, why can't we do the kind of planning that says, let's think about how we want to use technologies, and if degrowth is our solution, then let's work towards that.
Nice. Yulia, do you have thoughts on this?
Well, in Japan, the growth happened actually naturally.
Right. Yeah. Big time, right?
With the burst of the bubble and with the demographic change, and they're very, very concerned about this. And in fact, the whole discourse of robots is trying to think of like what are we going to do when everybody is above 65. And what's interesting is that I've seen this in articles from mid-60s. Like in the mid-60s, there's this roboticist who points out the demographic trend, and he says, like, look, like there are so many people born immediately after the war, and now it's great, but then the population is going to be shrinking.
Wow. And
he was right, because like that's exactly what's happening now. And one of the worries in Japan, and of course there are environmental concerns that people really understand, but it's also worry about paying the pension, paying retirement to all the older people with less people in the workforce, and in taking care of all the elderly people that with excellent Japanese medicine, they and this famous longevity, they live until long. So it's actually when you go outside of big cities, you can go into areas and you don't see anybody below 65. And they all work because somebody needs to work. And I think that there are some positive elements because there is a movement of younger people out of Tokyo, out of big cities to go back to farming, go back to life that is not a rat race. But it's not that significant yet. And I think that the bad effects of this change really felt in a lot of areas that outside of Tokyo.
Nice. We're heading towards the end here. Patrick, I really loved your intro. I
Sure.
wanted to give you a second if you had any thoughts or anything had been coming to you in the last couple of minutes, but I also don't want to put you on the spot, which is what I'm
No, that's fine. I made a couple comments on the chat bar that I think one of the ways to connect scholarship and activism is through engineering ethics. I don't think it's the only path, but I do think it's a framework that exists within a university or college structure that has the potential to to bring these different threads together.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I guess, also is, I think there are also lots of initiatives, within respective universities, which I know doesn't speak to, everybody in the audience today, but, like for example, I was on sabbatical leave this past year, and somehow in my absence, my school created a Center for Responsible Machine Learning.
Yeah.
So
those are popping up all over the place.
Yeah, not surprisingly, it's staffed only by computer scientists. And
there you go.
I'm trying to make some connections with them to basically see like what they're doing. So clearly there's some interest, and I guess maybe I can take some consolation in the fact that something done differently / badly maybe is better than it not being done at all.
Yeah.
But that remains to be seen. But I do think that place where ethics and history come together is a place to sort of bring scholarship and activism together in a productive way. That's all.
Totally. Yeah. Well, this has been so awesome. I want to thank Patrick, Diane, and Yulia for taking part in this future work discussion. We'll get it posted as soon as possible. I want to say that one thing I'd like to see around work and in our kind of fields is a kind of special interest group. That's in the Society for the History of Technology. We have what we call special interest groups. I would love to see a kind of STS special interest group around work and technology emerge, and maybe that's something we can talk about in the future. And also, I just want to throw out that if there's people or topics you'd like us to address in future roundtables, please let us know. And in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, Maintainers 3 shows up. So if you're around Washington, D.C., please stop by. And thank you again, you three, for taking part in this. It was really super awesome. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Lee and Jessica, for bringing it together.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.